All I've ever wanted to do is help people in my life. And if
Hmm.
someone can read my story and make their day just a little bit better, then that's all I can really ask for. And I think it helps both me and other autistic individuals learn how to, or at the very least, develop a baseline for how they can grieve.
Welcome, friends, to the eighth season of Bereaved But Still Me. Our purpose is to empower members of our community. I am Michael Lieben, and the father of three children, Idan, Sapir, and Liel. Liel, my youngest daughter, was born with a heart defect, and later she developed autism and epilepsy. Losing her at 15 is what has brought me here to be the host of this program. Here with us today are guests Dr. Ken Doka, Amy Tucci, and Alex LaMorie. Dr. Kenneth J. Doka is a member of the Autism and Grief Project Advisory Board and the Senior Vice President of Grief Programs at the Hospice Foundation of America. He is an ordained Lutheran minister, a licensed mental health counselor in the state of New York, and a professor emeritus at the Graduate School of the College of New Rochelle. Amy Tucci is the president and CEO of the Hospice Foundation of America, HFA. She began her work with HFA in 2004, directing its national annual Living with Grief educational event and its Washington, D.C. office and staff. She has produced numerous educational programs on advanced illness care and grief and has edited more than a dozen books on topics involving end of life, including ethics, pain management, child and adolescent grief, grief theory, aging, diversity, and spirituality. Alex LaMorie is an advisory board member on the Autism and Grief Project and an undergraduate student with autism at the University of Maryland Global Campus. His experiences with loss helped inform the project's development. Alex's expressive grief artwork has recently featured in the textbook Superhero Grief: The Transformative Power of Loss. Thank you all for joining us here on Bereaved But Still Me. Dr. Doka, welcome back to Bereaved But Still Me. It's always a pleasure to see you here. You were with us a number of years ago, and what you said then still resonates so much now with us and with our program. And I don't think an episode goes by that we don't quote you.
Thank you very much. It's certainly an honor to be on your program. I've always enjoyed my time with you guys, and really thought the conversations were important. So I'm delighted to be back. Thank you.
Could you tell us a little bit how you got involved with this project?
Well, I've been involved with the Hospice Foundation for somewhat over 30 years in terms of grief programs. And when the NLM Foundation put forth a call for resources for people with autism and grief, it seemed like a natural extension to us. The Hospice Foundation of America has always had a strong concern with recognizing the individuality of grief and then also recognizing the diversity of grief. So for us, we've dealt in past programs with different spiritualities, with different cultures, with different genders, with different social classes. It seemed a very natural way to again expand our exposure as we talked about grief in the neurodivergent community. Earlier, we had done some work on grief resources for persons with intellectual disabilities. So
Mm.
working together with the NLM Foundation to create resources for persons with autism, and especially for adults with autism, seemed like a natural approach. And again, there's lots of material on children in autism, but we were
Mm.
really excited about presenting material about adults with autism. That's a population whose needs are often really unmet.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would think that for whatever reason, I don't feel that it's been a group that's been addressed wholly in so much as other individual groups, be they ethnic, religious, or some form of disability. Somehow I've always felt that we got shunted to the side as families with autistic children.
Yes, I would agree.
Yeah, and therefore, again, I would just want to say thank you very much for this project. Personally, as someone who would have, under better circumstances, been about now facing that reality. My daughter today would be 27 years old. And so we didn't have that opportunity to educate her as an adult, to see her as an adult, to work with her as an adult. And I I'm aware that this is a group that somehow gets overlooked. Amy Tucci, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Michael. Great to be here.
You don't have a child with autism, so I'm curious how you became involved in the project and why you feel it's important.
We were approached by the NLM Family Foundation, which is a foundation that is focused mostly on scientific areas of research around autism. And as president and CEO of Hospice Foundation of America, they came to us to say, you know a lot about grief, and we think that you might want to submit a proposal for this grant we want to issue. And we were hesitant at first to do so because we do know a lot about grief at Hospice Foundation of America. We didn't know a lot about autism, but we have done programs. I think we were probably the first, some of the first in the field to do programs that took developmental disabilities and end-of-life care and grief into consideration. So we developed a plan and we involved many people with autism in the project to educate us. So that's really how it got off the ground, and we were very glad to do it.
I really think that's actually very interesting because my experience with autism is that everybody is different. I wish there was a rule book. If it had come with a manual, it might have been a lot easier here. So I really appreciate that you came to learn like that because it's not easy.
Yeah, I would just say, I think like there's no manual for grief, right? As people who know about grief know, and there's really no manual for autism. They're both so individual that in a lot of ways, the subjects kind of overlap in a lot of areas. Of course, nobody is the same, whether you're neurotypical or on the spectrum, but it was a real educational experience for us. And my background before I entered the world of end-of-life care and hospice was as a newspaper reporter. So I have always had a curiosity about learning things that people could benefit from and sharing those with people. So that kind of played into this too, I would think.
Our third panel member is Alex LaMorie. Thank you so much for joining us.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
You're a young adult with autism. Can you tell us how you became involved with the Autism and Grief Project?
My mom knew Amy Tucci, and I believe through her, my mom found out about the program, about the idea of autism and grief, and then I was approached by them, and that's really it, really. It's very simple. Just through connections.
And I'll add that
Anna.
we were not only it was Alex on the advisory board, but his mother, Dr. Jill Harrington LaMorie, was also part of our advisory board, which was very helpful in the development of the website.
As a parent of a child with autism, I totally understand the project and the aims. My daughter never reached adulthood. She left us when she was 15. But I often wondered what it would be like for her to experience the world as an adult. Not everybody is always there to explain things to her. And I knew that she took everything in and she probably understood more than we thought she did, but there was no way to have a conversation with her about it. She was very nonverbal. I would just want to say that from my own point of view, having recently experienced not only her grief, but the grief of my mother's loss, that the way these two come together is stunningly important for families. And before we go anywhere, I just want to say that I admire the whole concept of this work that you're doing, and in particular, the benefits that can be had not just to young adults with autism, but to their families is tremendous. And I thank you very much for that.
You are listening to Bereaved But Still Me. If you have a question or comment that you would like addressed on our program, please send an email to Michael Lieben at michael@bereavedbutstillme.com. That's michael@bereavedbutstillme.com. This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The opinions expressed in the podcast are not those of Hearts Unite the Globe, but of the hosts and guests, and are intended to spark discussion about issues pertaining to congenital heart disease or bereavement.
In this segment, I'd like to learn more about the Autism and Grief Project as it is. Ms. Tucci, please share with us some of the goals for the project and where it is right now in its development.
We launched the website in September 2022, but it's ever changing, and we take ideas that come to us from people who visit the website and update the website. And we've been putting new materials on it, such as additional social stories, specially tailored for adults with autism, and also Spanish language resources. Just to go back to the basics of the website, it's really a one-of-a-kind platform with a mission to help adults with autism navigate and cope with the complexities of grief arising from death and loss. And not only is it for adults with autism, it's also for their families and friends, and for professionals who work with them, and including members of clergy. And we pay a lot of attention to faith and not only death loss, but also animal companion loss and non-death loss. As Dr. Doka mentioned, we often, as a society, have put the emphasis on children with autism, but this resource, this website, fills a gap that just has never been addressed in the United States. And we have things like testimonials from autistic individuals who share their grief journeys. We have award-winning animations on the website that illustrate the intangible and profound emotions that arise from grief and loss. We also have social story templates that can help autistic individuals contextualize, frame, and understand their grief. So there are a wide range of resources, and resources for every part of the spectrum. So for people who maybe have higher needs than others, higher support needs, the resources are there for them. And for people with lower support needs, they may actually want to be looking at the professional section or the family section of the website. And I think everyone can find sort of their place on the website. We also have 2 continuing education programs for professionals. Both of those are free. One is specifically for clergy, and the other is for other healthcare and social service professionals. Nurses, social workers, counselors can all get free continuing education through the site. And the topic, of course, is autism and grief for adults with autism.
I'm particularly glad that you mentioned grief arising from death and loss, because one of the things that we've learned here is that there's so many other sources of grief and so many other things that could be considered grief that people don't always think of as grief. And one of the other professionals that we quote often enough on this program has said, everybody's always grieving something. And I believe that's true. And it was heartwarming to see that you have addressed pretty much everything that you could come to with it. So thank you very much for that. Dr. Doka, as a grief professional, is it possible that lessons learned here will not only benefit the autistic community and their families, but the entire or wider grieving public?
It's a good question, and I'm very confident that it will, for a number of reasons. The first thing I think that's important about this is, again, when a field develops, you keep sort of what I call moving on the edges. And again, by looking at the grief experiences of neurodivergent populations, whether it's persons with intellectual disabilities in the past or with autism now, it allows us to understand and expand our knowledge of grief in general. Second of all, it reminds us about the individuality, not just of the autistic population, which is, of course, a spectrum, but also of grief, which is, of course, a spectrum as well. We all respond differently to losses. Earl Groman used to say, grief is like fingerprints. Each person's grief is unique and individual to them. And by doing a project like this, it reminds the field of that really incredible diversity of grief reactions influenced by all kinds of factors. So I think this makes a major contribution to the field because, again, it expands the edges.
I think also it points out, if I can take a guess here, that the autistic community especially is different than a lot of other communities, and yet they suffer like anybody else suffers. When you use the metaphor that grief is like a fingerprint, I would say that's true. We're all different, but most of us have fingers. And so that we have something that we can all talk about. We have something that we can relate to. And I think including the autistic community is not only bold, but I think it's important because it is another way to bring them into where sometimes it's difficult for them to come into a larger community. So I certainly appreciate that.
Yeah, and I
No,
would agree with that entirely. Uh, Again, I think as we look at different populations and their unique experiences of grief, we learn more about each other, and that's always useful.
mhm. Alex, as someone living with autism, how do you think a project like the Autism and Grief Project actually helps you and other people that you know with autism?
Well, for me, it helps me get it sort of served as an outlet, like for me to sort of help deal with my own grief, to use my stories and write and put them in for the website. But it also helps others in the sense that I guess it helps me because I'm glad it helps. All I've ever wanted to do is help people in my life. And if
Hmm.
someone can read my story and make their day just a little bit better, then that's all I can really ask for. And I think it helps both me and other autistic individuals learn how to, or at the very least, develop a baseline for how they can grieve. It's all unique. Like autism is a
Hmm.
spectrum and grief is a spectrum. When you've met one
Hmm.
person who's grieving, you've met one person who's grieving. When you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. But at the
Sure.
same time, it's like your comment about fingerprints and how we all have fingers. There are general baselines, general commonalities that can be encompassed within both the autism and the grief world. And so we can use the Autism and Grief Project as a way to help sort of establish those baselines that other
Hmm.
autistic individuals can then use as a springboard to help find out what I like to call unique grieving tool is. And so I have my own unique grieving tool. And I think in order to you can use this as the baseline we've established on the website as a sort of springboard to help you find yours.
Hmm. I commend you for that. I recall when this program was getting its first legs almost 8 years ago, and I was trying to justify what we were doing to the people who pay for this project. And I said to them, our goal is to help even one person. If we can share our stories, if we can share our grief, we used to say that grief shared is grief lightened. If we could help somebody, just one person, then we've probably done our job. And since I was grieving and they've already helped me, I said, we're done here. The rest is gravy. And I really appreciate that you have that attitude because it shows a willingness on your part to share and to help others. And that's not always readily apparent in people. And I think you're part of a very special group here. Thank you for the work that you do.
Of course, I appreciate it.
If you've enjoyed listening to this program, please visit our website, heartsunitetheglobe.org, and make a contribution. This program is a presentation of Hearts Unite the Globe and is part of the Hug Podcast Network. Hearts Unite the Globe is a nonprofit organization devoted to providing resources to the congenital heart defect community to educate, empower, and enrich the lives of our community members. If you would like access to free resources pertaining to the CHD community, please visit our website at congenitalheartdefects.com for information about CHD, hospitals that treat CHD survivors, summer camps for CHD families, and much, much more. Welcome back to Bereaved But Still Me. Alex, how likely do you think the autism community is to search for this information? What can we do to make this information easier for people with autism to find?
Well, for me, when I have to do something or find something, whether for school or for something in general, I'm usually need to be prompted to do it. And I think we need to just spread awareness of it because you can't really look for something you're not aware that exists. And so to start that, to answer your question, the first step would be spreading awareness. And then the second one would be, say, hey, whether you have a son, daughter, cousin, whoever you want the website to help and say, hey, look, we have this website called Autism and Grief. Maybe you should go check it out. And so that's kind of simple, but yeah, it's
No,
very
it's a
simple
wonderful
like that.
idea. It's a wonderful idea. I can think of lots of organizations where I live that I would love to put the word out. The kind of information that you have is critically important, and people really need to know more about it, which is one of the reasons why we're happy to host you here on this episode, because we want to get the word out. We want everybody who's out there who has some contact with autism to find out that there really is hope and there really is help for everybody. Now, Ms. Tucci, it may be more likely that the parents of adults with autism or friends and loved ones may be more likely the ones to look for this information. What can we do to help these people find the Autism and Grief Project?
Well, I would direct them to autismandgrief.org and to the Family, Friends, and Support People portal of the website, which really outlines, I hope, almost everything they need to know to help support their autistic loved one. We review things like grief generally, but then talk about, for example, that for autistic individuals or individuals with autism, and I do want to make a note about that, just language choice, that there may be behavioral changes, no outward change, developmental regression, increased anxiety, physical changes. And many of these, of course, are true in the entire population.
My limited contact with this would be having to explain to my daughter when she was maybe 10 what it meant when her grandfather died.
Yeah.
I think she understood it.
Yeah. We actually have a whole section about delivering the news of a death, which I think is very helpful, because I think all parents are always, it's a horrible thing to have to do. And you're never really sure as a parent how to deliver that news. So we provide some guidelines, especially with autism in mind, for delivering that information. Sometimes, depending on where the person is on the spectrum, there may be an ability to grasp the permanentness of the death, and just the abstract nature of death generally can be very difficult. And many individuals with autism are concrete thinkers, so they might grasp the fact that a person is gone, but they might struggle with identifying their feelings about the person's absence. And those feelings that they demonstrate may be out of sync with how society perceives grief reaction should be. So when that happens, and then I defer to Dr. Doka on this, it's very easy for an adult with autism to become disenfranchised while grieving. And Dr. Doka would address that better. But before, I did just want to note also that on the website, there is some controversy within the autism community about whether people should be addressed as individuals with autism or autistic people or autistic individuals, person first or not. We decided to use both approaches on the website because we wanted to try to make everyone happy. So people
Good luck.
Yeah, people who felt strongly about one way would find it there, and people who wanted it a different way would find it there as well. But anyway, we wanted to respect everyone's feelings about that. Michael, I don't know if Dr. Doka wanted, as the expert in disenfranchised grief, whether he wanted to add anything about disenfranchised grief.
Well, we'll go there in a minute.
Yeah.
We did a whole program on disenfranchised grief, and I would love to revisit that. But before we do that, I just want to make a couple of comments. I'm glad that you mentioned the concept of the permanence of death and how people with autism may or may not understand that. I think my daughter got it. I think when I would, over the first year or so after my father died, I would quiz her, where's grandpa, what's going on? She sort of knew, and not sort of, I think she really knew. On the other hand, the next 2 or 3 years after she died, we would go visit the place where she was living. We had an annual basketball tournament for 3 years, and they dedicated a space in the garden for her. And every time we would go, there was always 1 or 2 kids who would ask us, where's Liel? And this is 3 years after she was no longer there. 3 years after she had died, they'd still ask us, where is she? And I felt that was interesting, that I hadn't thought that would be an issue. I hadn't thought that conceptualizing, understanding death would be an issue. And for some people, I suppose it is. I'm not even sure if that's necessarily an autistic thing or if that's just some people don't get it. I'm glad you mentioned it, because it's the kind of thing that, you could find after you've, made yourself blue and done all the explaining in the world, and then, so where is he? And then you have to start all over again. So I admire that you're working in that direction.
The website gives ideas and tips about how to approach those things as a parent or friend or caregiver.
Well, I can speak on behalf of everybody. I wish that had been there when I needed it. So good on you. Dr. Doka, I had a different question for you, but I think we're going to go back to disenfranchised grief. I think it's impossible not to. I hadn't realized that this might lead to disenfranchisement. I'm not sure I get that. Maybe you could explain how that's a possibility here with a very, very short definition of what is disenfranchised grief. And I remind everybody who's listening, we have an entire program just on that.
Oh, thank you, Michael. Disenfranchised grief, very briefly, is where a person experiences a loss, and for some reason, that loss is neither socially sanctioned, publicly acknowledged, or socially supported. And that often happens with persons with autism because, as Amy had said, they may show their grief in different ways, in ways that are, as she said, out of sync with how we expect grief to be shown. And again, because of some of the issues in accessing emotions, the way they express their grief may not always be understood as grief. And I think probably one of the most important things that we can do as a grief community is really put the message that people with autism, autistic individuals, grieve. They grieve all kinds of losses. They grieve the loss of family members from death. They grieve separation. Some of the more highly functioning persons may grieve the fact that they have autism. So again, there's grief on all different levels. And again, no matter how it's expressed, it's important to acknowledge that grief, to validate that grief. So that to me is really critical. We want to enfranchise rather than disenfranchise grief.
I appreciate that because a lot of times, as you said, their reactions may not be understood or may not seem appropriate. And they are appropriate for that person. You just may not get it. We're living on a different plane of what is appropriate. We need to connect with them that way to help bring people with autism into our moment of grief and join with them and allow them in whatever way to join with us because we're families.
Yeah, and sometimes that's done with the best of intentions. Well, let's not upset the person. There's an aura of protectionism, but that can be very damaging because people respond to changes in their environment. And in many ways, if someone is no longer visiting or part of their life, it helps to have a reason for that. And sometimes our efforts to protect really become counterproductive and, in fact, do disenfranchise the populations we are even trying to assist.
That's a very scary thought that as a parent, we think we're doing the right thing and we might actually be going the wrong way with that. Another reason why we need this project so that people can log in and find out strategies and ways to explain grief to people who might otherwise not be there to understand it the way we want them to. So again, a great thing to do. And again, I urge everybody who's involved with autism in their personal lives to check out the site and look for information and suggestions because there's an unending feeling as a parent that we're doing this alone. Even when we go to huge support groups and have lots and lots of friends, and there's always that point where you still feel like you're very much alone.
Very definitely.
And that concludes this episode of Bereaved But Still Me. I want to thank Dr. Ken Doka, Amy Tucci, and Alex LaMorie for sharing their experiences and wisdom with us. Please join us at the beginning of the month for a brand new podcast. I'll talk with you soon, but until then, please remember, moving forward is not moving away.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you have felt supported in your grief journey. Bereaved But Still Me is a monthly podcast, and a new episode is released on the first Thursday of each month. You can hear our podcast anywhere you normally listen to podcasts at any time. Join us again next month for a brand new episode of Bereaved But Still Me.